You'll be lucky if you get enough for a cup of coffee from Mom's will. Those were the last words my daughter Jessica spoke to me before we walked into that lawyer's office. She was smirking, practically bouncing with excitement as she whispered to her brother Marcus about how they were finally going to be rid of me forever. They had no idea what was coming. Neither did I. What happened in that mahogany-paneled conference room would shatter everything my children thought they knew about their mother, about our marriage, and about me. When the lawyer read that one sentence, just 23 words that would change all our lives forever, my daughter's scream of rage could probably be heard 3 blocks away. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how we got to that moment, you need to know the whole story. Before we dive into this incredible tale of family secrets and ultimate justice, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for his sweet revenge. We post amazing stories daily of people who got the revenge they deserved when their own family turned against them. Now, let me tell you how my ex-wife's final gift became the sweetest revenge of all. My name is Robert Harrison, and I'm 68 years old. This story begins 45 years ago when I first met the woman who would become my wife, but it reaches its shocking climax just 3 years ago in a lawyer's office in downtown Chicago. I met Margaret Sullivan in 1978 at Northwestern University, where I was studying engineering and she was pursuing a business degree. I was 23, a farm boy from rural Illinois who had gotten into Northwestern on a partial scholarship and was working 3 jobs to pay for the rest. She was brilliant, ambitious, and absolutely stunning at 19 years old. Margaret came from money. Her father owned a successful construction company, and her family lived in one of those grand houses in Lake Forest, about 30 miles north of Chicago. I should have been intimidated, but Margaret never made me feel that way. She was drawn to my work ethic and determination, and I was mesmerized by her intelligence and drive. "You're going to do great things, Bobby," she used to tell me. "I can see it in your eyes." We were inseparable through college. While her sorority sisters dated fraternity boys who would inherit their father's businesses, Margaret chose the scholarship kid who ate ramen noodles for dinner and wore the same 3 shirts in rotation. We married right after graduation in 1982. I was 27, she was 23. It was a beautiful wedding at her family's country club in Lake Forest, and despite my humble background, Margaret's parents welcomed me with open arms. Her father, Charles Sullivan, even offered me a job at his construction company. "I've been watching you, son," he told me at our wedding reception. "You've got something special. Drive, vision. I could use someone like you." I was grateful for the opportunity, but I had bigger dreams. I wanted to start my own engineering firm, to build something from the ground up. Margaret supported my decision completely. "We'll build an empire together," she said, her eyes shining with excitement. "You'll design it and I'll run it." And that's exactly what we did. I started Harrison Engineering in 1983 with a $10,000 loan from the bank and an office that was literally a converted garage in Schaumburg, a suburb northwest of Chicago. Margaret handled the business side while I focused on the technical work. Those first few years were brutal. We lived in a tiny apartment above a diner, drove a 15-year-old Ford that broke down monthly, and ate mac and cheese 4 nights a week. But Margaret never complained. Not once. "Every great success story starts with struggle," she would say when I worried about our finances. "We're building something that will last forever." She was absolutely right. By 1987, Harrison Engineering had grown to 15 employees and was landing major contracts throughout the greater Chicago area. By 1992, we had offices in Chicago, Milwaukee, and Indianapolis, and were pulling in over $8 million in revenue annually. Margaret was the driving force behind our expansion. While I was the technical genius who could design anything from shopping centers to office complexes, she was the business mastermind. She negotiated deals, managed finances, and developed the strategic vision that turned my small engineering firm into a regional powerhouse. "You're the heart of this company," I used to tell her. "I might design the buildings, but you built the business." Our children were born during these growth years. Jessica arrived in 1985, when I was 30 and Margaret was 26. Marcus followed in 1988, when I was 33 and Margaret was 29. They grew up in a world of privilege that neither Margaret nor I had known as children. We had moved to a beautiful house in Naperville by then, complete with excellent schools and safe neighborhoods. Private schools, summer camps, family vacations to Europe. We gave them everything we'd never had. But somewhere along the way, something changed in Margaret. It started subtly in the late 1990s. Margaret began working longer hours, traveling more frequently to our branch offices, making decisions without consulting me. When I tried to discuss it with her, she brushed off my concerns. "The business is at a critical juncture," she would say. "I need to focus." I understood her dedication. After all, we had built this company together. But I missed the partnership we used to have, the sense that we were a team working toward common goals. I found myself making the hour-long commute to our Chicago office alone more often, while Margaret flew to Indianapolis or Milwaukee for days at a time. The distance between us grew wider as the children entered their teenage years. Margaret threw herself even deeper into work, often staying at the office until midnight and leaving before dawn. Our conversations became limited to logistics. Who was picking up Jessica from soccer practice? What time Marcus needed to be at his piano lesson? Which parent would attend the school play? I tried desperately to bridge the gap. I planned romantic getaways to Door County, Wisconsin, suggested we take dancing lessons together at the local community center, proposed that we hire a general manager so Margaret could step back from day-to-day operations and focus on our family. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," she would say dismissively. "This business doesn't run itself." But I did understand. I was still designing every major project, still meeting with clients, still working 60-hour weeks while commuting between our 3 offices. The difference was that I wanted to share that pressure with my wife, while she seemed determined to carry it alone. By 2005, we were more like business partners than husband and wife. We attended company functions together, maintained a united front for the children, and kept up appearances for the sake of our social circle in Naperville. But the intimacy, the connection, the partnership that had defined our early years was gone. The breaking point came in 2008 during the financial crisis. Harrison Engineering, like many companies, was hit hard by the economic downturn. Several major projects were canceled, and we had to lay off nearly half our workforce. Our Milwaukee office closed entirely, and the Indianapolis office was operating at a loss. I proposed that we weather the storm together, take temporary pay cuts, and focus on smaller residential projects until the economy recovered. Margaret had a radically different vision. "We need to pivot completely," she announced during a company meeting at our Chicago headquarters. "Commercial real estate development. Buy distressed properties, renovate them, flip them for profit." It was a radical departure from our core business, and I had serious reservations. Engineering firms and real estate development companies required completely different skill sets, client relationships, and financial structures. "We're engineers, not real estate developers," I argued. "We don't know that market." "Then we'll learn," she said firmly. "This is our chance to diversify and grow beyond what we ever imagined." What followed was the most difficult period in our marriage. Margaret threw our entire company into real estate development, investing millions in properties throughout the Chicago area. She hired new staff with backgrounds in construction and property management, formed partnerships with developers I'd never met, and made financial commitments that kept me awake at night with worry. "Trust me," she would say whenever I expressed concerns. "I know what I'm doing." And amazingly, she did. By 2010, Margaret's real estate ventures had not only saved our company but had made us wealthier than we'd ever imagined. The properties she'd bought during the recession had tripled in value. The renovations and developments she'd overseen were generating enormous profits. Buildings that we purchased for $500,000 were selling for $1.5 million after renovation. Harrison Engineering evolved into Harrison Development Group, with Margaret as CEO and me as Chief Technical Officer. Our annual revenue grew from $8 million to $25 million by 2014, then to $40 million by 2016 when our divorce was finalized. But success came at a devastating cost to our marriage. Margaret became consumed by work in a way that bordered on obsession. She traveled constantly, often spending weeks at a time overseeing projects in Detroit, St. Louis, and eventually expanding into markets as far away as Denver and Phoenix. When she was home, she was on conference calls with investors, reviewing contracts with legal teams, or meeting with potential partners. Our marriage existed only on paper. "I'm building a legacy for our children," she would say when I tried to discuss our deteriorating relationship. "Everything I'm doing is for Jessica and Marcus." I understood her motivation, but I mourned the loss of the woman I'd fallen in love with. The Margaret who used to talk about building an empire together had been replaced by someone who seemed to view me as just another employee who needed to be managed rather than consulted. The children, now in college, began to notice the tension between us. But instead of being concerned about their parents' marriage, they seemed to view me as the problem. "Why can't you just support Mom?" Jessica asked me during a family dinner in 2012. She was home from Northwestern, where she was studying marketing, following in her mother's footsteps. At 27, she had clearly absorbed her mother's business-first mentality. "She's doing incredible things, and all you do is complain." "I'm not complaining," I said. "I'm trying to have a conversation about our marriage." "Marriage is about supporting each other's dreams," Marcus added. He was 24, at University of Illinois studying finance, clearly influenced by watching his mother's business success. "Mom's dreams are bigger than yours, so maybe you should step up." I was stunned by their attitude, but I shouldn't have been surprised. Margaret had always been their hero, the brilliant businesswoman who could do no wrong. In their eyes, I was just the technical guy who couldn't keep up with their mother's vision. What I didn't realize at the time was that Margaret had been systematically rewriting the history of our marriage in her conversations with the children. She painted herself as the visionary entrepreneur held back by a small-minded husband who couldn't appreciate her talents. She portrayed my attempts to preserve our relationship as jealousy and insecurity rather than love and concern. The divorce proceedings began in 2015, after Margaret finally admitted that our marriage was over. I was 60 years old. She was 56. "We've grown in different directions," she said during our last serious conversation as husband and wife. We were sitting in our living room in Naperville, the same room where we'd once planned our future together. "I need someone who can match my ambition, who shares my vision for the future." "I thought I was that person," I said quietly. "You were," she replied coldly. 20 years ago. But I've evolved, and you've stayed the same." It was the most hurtful thing she'd ever said to me, but I didn't fight it. After 33 years of marriage, I was exhausted from trying to reconnect with someone who clearly didn't want to be reconnected with. The divorce was finalized in 2016, and it was devastating both financially and emotionally. Margaret kept the company Harrison Development Group, which was valued at approximately $30 million at the time. The business had grown significantly since 2010, with major projects in 6 different states. I received a settlement of $3.2 million, the house we'd lived in for 20 years, and a consulting contract with the company that would pay me $8,000 per month for 3 years. But the financial settlement was nothing compared to losing my children. Jessica and Marcus, now adults with their own careers, sided completely with their mother. In their minds, I was the one who had held Margaret back, who had been too small-minded to appreciate her brilliance, who had ultimately forced her to choose between her marriage and her success. "You never supported her dreams," Jessica told me after the divorce was final. She had just started working at a marketing firm in Chicago, and her success seemed to validate her belief in her mother's approach to life. "You were always trying to keep her small." "That's not true," I protested. "I supported her every step of the way. By complaining about every decision she made, by questioning her judgment, by making her feel guilty for being successful." I realized then that Margaret had been telling a very different story about our marriage to the children. In her version, I was the insecure husband who couldn't handle his wife's success, who had spent years undermining her confidence and sabotaging her ambitions. It wasn't true, but it didn't matter. The children believed it completely. Over the next few years, my relationship with Jessica and Marcus deteriorated further. They rarely called, seldom visited, and when they did interact with me, it was with barely concealed resentment. Meanwhile, Margaret's business continued to flourish. Harrison Development Group expanded into new markets, acquired smaller companies, and developed increasingly ambitious projects. By 2020, the company was reportedly worth over $50 million, making Margaret one of the most successful female entrepreneurs in the Midwest. She was featured in business magazines and invited to speak at conferences across the country. I was proud of her success, even though it came at the cost of our marriage and my relationship with our children. I had always known Margaret was destined for greatness, and I was genuinely happy that she had achieved her dreams. But I was also profoundly lonely. The consulting contract with Harrison Development Group had ended in 2019, and at 64, I found it difficult to find new work. Younger engineers with more current technology skills were getting the jobs I applied for. My savings from the divorce settlement were dwindling, and I was beginning to worry about my financial future. The house in Naperville was expensive to maintain, and I was seriously considering selling it and moving to a smaller apartment. I reached out to Jessica and Marcus several times, hoping to rebuild our relationship, but they made it clear that they viewed me as a burden from their past. "Dad, you need to figure out your own life," Marcus told me during one particularly painful phone conversation in late 2020. "You can't keep living in the past." "I'm not living in the past," I said. "I'm just trying to have a relationship with my children." "A relationship goes both ways," Jessica added. She was on speakerphone, and I could hear the impatience in her voice. "You need to bring something to the table besides complaints about how Mom treated you." It was a harsh assessment, but it forced me to examine my own behavior. Had I been dwelling too much on the past? Was I making my children choose between their parents instead of accepting the new reality of our family? I decided to step back and give them space, hoping that time would heal the wounds between us. That was my mistake. The distance I thought was temporary became permanent. Months passed without phone calls. Holidays came and went without invitations. I learned about major events in their lives through social media: Jessica's promotion to vice president at her marketing firm, Marcus's engagement to his longtime girlfriend Sarah in early 2021. I sent congratulations cards and gifts, but received only perfunctory thank you texts in response. By 2021, I felt like a stranger to my own children. At 66 years old, I was facing the prospect of spending my remaining years completely alone. Then, in March 2022, everything changed. I was at home on a Tuesday evening, watching the news and eating a dinner of leftover pizza, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Jessica's number, and for a moment, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe she was finally ready to rebuild our relationship. "Dad." Her voice was strange, shaky, and emotional. "Jessica, how are you?" "Sweetheart." "Dad, I have terrible news. Mom is in the hospital." The world seemed to stop. "What happened?" "She collapsed at work this afternoon. The doctors think it was a stroke, but they're running more tests." "Dad, it doesn't look good." I was at Northwestern Memorial Hospital within an hour. Margaret was in the ICU, surrounded by machines and monitors. She looked smaller than I remembered, fragile in a way that seemed impossible for someone who had always been such a force of nature. At 63, she was still relatively young, still vital, still the dynamo who had built a business empire. Jessica and Marcus were there, along with several employees from Harrison Development Group. Everyone was devastated. Margaret wasn't just their boss or mother. She was the center of their universe, the person they all relied on for strength and direction. "The doctors say she has maybe a few days," Marcus told me quietly. "There was massive brain damage from the stroke." I spent the next 3 days at the hospital, taking turns with Jessica and Marcus to sit by Margaret's bedside. It was the most time I'd spent with my children in years, and despite the tragic circumstances, I was grateful for the opportunity to be with them during this crisis. On the 3rd day, Margaret briefly regained consciousness. "Bobby?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here," I said, taking her hand. Felt so small and cold. She looked at me with eyes that seemed to recognize something she had forgotten. "I'm sorry," she said so quietly I almost didn't hear her, For what? For everything. For losing us. Before I could respond, she slipped back into unconsciousness. She died that evening, surrounded by family and colleagues who loved her. The funeral was held a week later at the same Presbyterian church in Naperville where we had been married exactly 40 years earlier. Hundreds of people attended: employees, business partners, clients, friends from our social circle. Margaret had touched many lives, and the outpouring of grief was overwhelming. I sat with Jessica and Marcus during the service, and for the first time in years we felt like a family again. Grief, it seemed, had temporarily bridged the gap between us. But that bridge proved to be more fragile than I realized. 2 weeks after the funeral, I received a call from Margaret's attorney, James Mitchell. "Robert, I need to schedule a reading of Margaret's will. Can you be available next Friday at 2 p.m.? "Of course," I said. "Should I expect anything significant?" There was a pause. "I think it's best if we discuss everything during the reading. Please plan to be at my office in the loop." I assumed the call was a formality. Margaret and I had been divorced for 6 years, and our financial affairs had been settled long ago. I figured she might have left me a small token, maybe a piece of jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother, or perhaps a few $1,000s as a gesture of goodwill. I wasn't expecting much, and based on their comments leading up to the will reading, neither were Jessica and Marcus. "I'm sure Mom left you something nice," Jessica said when I mentioned the appointment. "Maybe some of your old engineering books, or Dad's collection of drafting tools." "Don't get your hopes up for anything substantial," Marcus added. "Mom was very clear about wanting to leave her estate to people who had supported her dreams." Their comments stung more than they realized, but I tried not to take them personally. According to the business magazines, Margaret had built an empire worth over $50 million. It made sense that she would leave it to our children and the people who had helped her achieve that success. However, what I would later learn was that the company's apparent value had been inflated by the economic boom and speculation in commercial real estate. The pandemic, supply chain issues, and rising interest rates had significantly impacted the company's actual worth by 2022. Several major projects had been delayed or canceled, and the company was carrying substantial debt from its rapid expansion. The morning of the will reading, I put on my best suit, the same navy blue one I'd worn to Margaret's funeral, and drove downtown to James Mitchell's law office. It was located in a gleaming skyscraper overlooking Lake Michigan, the kind of building that Margaret's company might have developed. Jessica and Marcus were already in the conference room when I arrived, along with several people I didn't recognize. There was Margaret's assistant, Patricia, who had worked for her for over a decade. There was Alexander Petrov, the current CEO of Harrison Development Group, who had been Margaret's protege and rumored romantic interest. There were also 2 other business associates whose names I vaguely recognized from company newsletters. Everyone was dressed in expensive suits and carrying leather portfolios. They looked like the kind of successful, driven people who had surrounded Margaret in her final years. I felt completely out of place. "Dad," Jessica said as I took a seat across from her. "I'm glad you came." Her tone was polite but distant, as if I were a family friend rather than her father. Marcus nodded in my direction but didn't speak. He was scrolling through his phone, apparently more interested in his messages than in his mother's final wishes. James Mitchell entered the conference room at exactly 2 p.m., carrying a thick folder and wearing the grave expression appropriate for such occasions. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "As you know, we're gathered to read the last will and testament of Margaret Elizabeth Sullivan Harrison, who passed away on March 15, 2022. He opened the folder and withdrew a document that appeared to be several pages long. Margaret's will is quite detailed, so I'll be reading it in sections. Let me start with some of the smaller bequests. Over the next 20 minutes, James Mitchell read through various gifts that Margaret had left to employees, charities, and organizations. Patricia received $75,000 and a generous severance package. Several longtime employees received bonuses equivalent to 1 year's salary. Her alma mater, Northwestern University, received $500,000 for a scholarship fund in business and engineering. Jessica and Marcus exchanged satisfied looks. These were exactly the kind of thoughtful, generous gifts they would have expected from their mother. The total value of these charitable and employee bequests, James Mitchell noted, comes to approximately $2.3 million. Now we come to the primary beneficiaries. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Jessica straightened in her chair. Marcus put down his phone. Alexander Petrov leaned forward with obvious interest. To my daughter Jessica Marie Harrison, I leave my personal jewelry collection, valued at approximately $200,000, and the sum of $2.5 million to be distributed in equal installments over 5 years, beginning on her 35th birthday. Jessica smiled and reached over to squeeze Marcus's hand. At 37, she had already received her first installment. To my son Marcus James Harrison, I leave my art collection, valued at approximately $300,000, and the sum of $2.5 million to be distributed in equal installments over 5 years, beginning on his 35th birthday. Marcus nodded approvingly. At 34, he would receive his first payment next year. $5.5 million between them was generous, but not surprising given Margaret's wealth. To my business partner and dear friend Alexander Petrov, I leave 10% ownership in Harrison Development Group, along with the authority to serve as CEO for a minimum of 10 years. Alexander Petrov's face lit up. A 10% stake in what he believed was a $50 million company meant he was inheriting $5 million worth of equity. James Mitchell paused and looked around the room. These individual bequests total approximately $8.3 million in value. The remainder of Margaret's estate, including her 90% ownership stake in Harrison Development Group, her real estate holdings, and her liquid assets, totaling approximately $12.7 million, goes to. Jessica was practically bouncing in her seat. Marcus had a huge grin on his face. They clearly expected to inherit the remaining $12.7 million between them, which would bring the total estate value to exactly $21 million. I felt happy for them. Despite our strained relationship, they were my children, and I wanted them to be financially secure. But then James Mitchell said something that no one in that room was expecting. The remainder of Margaret's estate goes to my former husband, Robert James Harrison, in recognition of his foundational role in building the company that became the source of my wealth, and in gratitude for his unwavering partnership during the most important years of my life. The silence that followed was absolute. I stared at James Mitchell, certain I had misheard him. Jessica's smile vanished. Marcus looked like he had been slapped. "I'm sorry," Alexander Petrov said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you say Robert Harrison gets the remaining $12.7 million? That's correct," James Mitchell replied calmly. Robert Harrison inherits 90% ownership of Harrison Development Group, plus all other remaining assets. Jessica stood up so fast her chair fell backward. "That's impossible," she screamed. "There has to be a mistake." The scream was so loud and piercing that everyone in the room jumped. It was a sound of pure rage and disbelief, the cry of someone whose entire worldview had just been shattered. I'm certain people 3 blocks away could hear it. "I assure you there's no mistake," James Mitchell said gently. "This will was executed properly and is legally binding." "But she divorced him," Marcus shouted, jumping to his feet beside his sister. "She hated him. She told us he never supported her." "I understand this is surprising," James Mitchell began. "Surprising?" Jessica's voice cracked with hysteria. "It's insane. Why would she leave everything to him?" James Mitchell cleared his throat and consulted the document again. "Actually, Margaret included a letter explaining her decision. Would you like me to read it?" "Yes," Jessica demanded. "Read it right now." James Mitchell withdrew a sealed envelope from his folder, opened it carefully, and began to read. "To my children Jessica and Marcus, and to everyone else who is hearing this will read today. I know my decision to leave the majority of my estate to Robert will come as a shock, especially to my children. You have spent years believing that your father was the problem in our marriage, that he held me back from achieving my full potential. I allowed you to believe this because it was easier than admitting the truth about what our marriage became. The truth is that Robert Harrison was the best partner I ever had, in business and in life. When I started Harrison Engineering with nothing but a dream and a $10,000 loan, Robert could have demanded equal credit for our success. Instead, he quietly handled the technical work while encouraging me to become the face of the company. When I wanted to expand into new markets, he supported me even when he had reservations. When I decided to pivot our entire business model during the recession, he trusted my judgment even though it terrified him. For 30 years, Robert put my ambitions ahead of his own ego. He could have insisted on being CEO of the company he founded, but he was content to let me lead because he knew I was better at it. He could have demanded recognition for his contributions, but he was proud to see me succeed even when it meant he remained in the shadows. I repaid his partnership by gradually pushing him out of the business we built together. I became so focused on growth and success that I forgot the man who had made it all possible. I turned our marriage into a corporate relationship and our family into a board of directors where his voice mattered less and less. When Robert tried to discuss our problems, I dismissed his concerns as jealousy. When he suggested we spend more time together, I accused him of not understanding my responsibilities. When he proposed that we step back from work to focus on our relationship, I told him he lacked ambition. I was wrong about everything. Robert Harrison is not a man who lacked ambition. He's a man who understood that success without love is meaningless. He's not someone who couldn't keep up with my vision. He's someone who tried to remind me that our original vision included being happy together. By the time I realized what I had lost, it was too late. Robert was too hurt to forgive me, and I was too proud to admit I had been wrong. So I let our marriage end and convinced myself that I was better off alone. But I wasn't better off alone. I spent the last 6 years of my life achieving everything I thought I wanted. I built a business empire. I was featured on magazine covers and invited to speak at conferences. I was recognized as one of the most successful businesswomen in the region. But I was lonely every single day. The empire I built was hollow because I had destroyed the partnership that gave it meaning. The success I achieved felt empty because I had no one who truly understood the journey to share it with. I know that Robert struggled financially after our divorce, and I know that my children blamed him for problems that were actually my fault. This will is my attempt to restore the balance that I destroyed. Robert Harrison deserves to inherit the company he helped build. He deserves financial security in his retirement. Most importantly, he deserves recognition for the 30 years he spent supporting a woman who forgot to appreciate him. To my children, I hope you will eventually understand that your father is a good man who deserved better than what I gave him. The money I'm leaving you is substantial enough to provide security and independence, but structured so that you'll learn the value of building something meaningful with your own hands. I want you to create something worthwhile with your lives, just as your father and I once did together. To Alexander and my other colleagues, Robert built this company before you knew it existed. He has earned the right to decide its future. And to Robert, I'm sorry it took me dying to finally tell you the truth. You were right about everything that mattered. I hope you can find some happiness in your remaining years, and I hope you can forgive a foolish woman who realized too late what she had thrown away. With all my love and deepest regrets, Margaret. The conference room was dead silent when James Mitchell finished reading. I was crying. Couldn't help it. Hearing Margaret's words, her real feelings about our marriage, her acknowledgement of my contributions, her regret about how things ended, was overwhelming after years of believing she thought I was worthless. But Jessica and Marcus were looking at me with pure hatred. "This is your fault," Jessica hissed. "You manipulated her somehow. You probably visited her in the hospital and convinced her to change the will," Marcus added. "You took advantage of a sick woman." "That's not true," I said quietly. "I had no idea." "Bullshit," Jessica screamed. "You planned this whole thing." She turned to James Mitchell. "When was this will written? I want to see the dates on everything." James Mitchell consulted his files. The will was originally written in 2019 and updated in 2021. The final version was executed in January of this year, 2 months before Margaret's stroke. January? Marcus looked confused. "But Dad wasn't even talking to Mom in January." "That's correct. James Mitchell confirmed. According to my records, Robert had no knowledge of this will until today. Jessica was pacing around the conference room like a caged animal. This isn't over, she said, pointing at me. We're going to contest this will. We're going to prove that Mom wasn't in her right mind when she wrote it. You have that right, James Mitchell said calmly. But I should warn you that Margaret anticipated this possibility. She included extensive documentation of her mental competency, including evaluations from 2 independent psychiatrists and a comprehensive financial analysis showing her clear understanding of her assets and their disposition. Alexander Petrov, who had been silent during this entire exchange, finally spoke up. Robert, he said, I think we should schedule a meeting to discuss the transition of leadership at Harrison Development Group. Of course, I said, still trying to process everything that had happened. This is insane, Jessica muttered. Absolutely insane. She and Marcus stormed out of the conference room without another word, leaving me alone with James Mitchell and the others. Well, James Mitchell said with a slight smile, that went about as expected. You knew this would happen? Margaret warned me that the children would be upset. She also asked me to give you this. He handed me another sealed envelope with my name written in Margaret's handwriting. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message. Bobby, I hope someday you can forgive me for the years I wasted being too stubborn to admit I was wrong. You deserved so much better than what I gave you. Please use this inheritance to build the life you should have had all along. The business is struggling more than anyone knows. We're carrying nearly $10 million in debt from overexpansion and several projects that went over budget. The pandemic and rising interest rates have been brutal. But I believe you can save it the same way you once built it, with integrity, patience, and genuine care for people. At the bottom of the note was a P.S. The kids will come around eventually. They're angry now, but they're not stupid. They'll figure out that you're the good guy in this story. I wasn't so sure about that last part. Over the next few days, the reality of my inheritance began to sink in. I now own 90% of Harrison Development Group, plus Margaret's house in Lake Forest, her investment portfolio, and her other assets. On paper, I had inherited nearly $13 million in assets. But as I began to examine the company's books with Alexander Petrov, I discovered that Margaret's private note had been accurate. The business was in serious financial trouble. The company was carrying nearly $10 million in debt from rapid expansion and several projects that had gone significantly over budget. Rising interest rates had made construction financing extremely expensive, and several major developments had been put on hold indefinitely. When you subtracted the debt from the company's assets, the actual net worth was closer to $11 million, bringing the total inheritance value to approximately $21 million, exactly what the will had stated. Still, even after accounting for the debt and financial challenges, my inheritance was worth enough to transform my life completely. But the money felt strange in my hands. It wasn't something I had earned through my own work. It was Margaret's final apology, her attempt to balance the scales between us. Jessica and Marcus, as promised, immediately hired lawyers to contest the will. They claimed that Margaret had been suffering from depression and anxiety that impaired her judgment. They argued that I had exercised undue influence over her during her final illness, despite the fact that I hadn't spoken to her in years before her stroke. It was painful to be accused of such things by my own children, but I understood their anger. From their perspective, I was a stranger who had swooped in to steal their inheritance. However, there was a critical legal issue that made the situation extremely complicated. When a will is contested, the assets are typically frozen until the legal challenge is resolved. This meant that while I technically owned 90% of Harrison Development Group, I couldn't make major business decisions, access company funds, or receive any financial benefit from the inheritance until the courts settled the dispute. David Chun and I had to negotiate a complex legal arrangement that allowed the business to continue operating under a court-appointed trustee while the will contest proceeded. I could provide input and guidance on technical matters, but I couldn't make executive decisions, change company policies, or receive any financial benefit from the inheritance. This period was incredibly stressful. The company was bleeding money. Several key employees were considering leaving for more stable positions, and I was still living on my dwindling savings while paying substantial legal fees to defend against my own children's lawsuit. The legal battle lasted exactly 14 months and cost both sides hundreds of thousands of dollars in attorney fees. Jessica and Marcus hired one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms, while I was represented by a smaller firm that specialized in will contests. The case hinged on Margaret's mental state when she wrote the will. My children's lawyers argued that her divorce, business pressures, and social isolation had caused depression that impaired her judgment. They claimed that leaving the majority of her estate to an ex-husband she hadn't spoken to in years was evidence of mental instability. My lawyers countered with Margaret's extensive documentation. She had undergone psychological evaluations specifically to establish her mental competency. She had worked with financial advisors to understand the full scope of her assets. She had consulted with business partners about the future of Harrison Development Group. Most importantly, Margaret had written detailed memos explaining her reasoning for each decision in the will. These weren't emotional outbursts or impulsive choices. They were carefully considered decisions based on her understanding of what would be best for her family and her business. In the end, the will was upheld in May 2023. Margaret's documentation was too thorough, her reasoning too clear, her mental competency too well established. Jessica and Marcus were forced to accept that their mother's final wishes were legally binding. But accepting the legal reality didn't mean they accepted me. "I hope you're happy," Jessica said when we ran into each other at the courthouse after the final hearing. "You've destroyed what was left of our family." "I never wanted this to happen," I told her. "I would trade all the money in the world to have a relationship with you and Marcus." "Then give it back," she said coldly. "Donate it all to charity and prove that you're not just a greedy old man who manipulated his dying ex-wife." It was a test, and we both knew it. Jessica wanted to see if I cared more about money or family. The truth was, I cared more about family. But I also understood that giving away Margaret's inheritance wouldn't restore my relationship with my children. It would only confirm their belief that I was weak and easily manipulated. Margaret had left me this inheritance for a reason, and she had specifically wanted Jessica and Marcus to understand that reason. Throwing away her final gift would dishonor her memory and waste the opportunity she had given me to rebuild my life. So I kept the money, and I kept the company. Once the legal proceedings were completed, Alexander Petrov and I worked together to transition leadership of Harrison Development Group. He remained as CEO while I took on the role of chairman of the board. It was an arrangement that allowed him to continue running day-to-day operations while giving me ultimate oversight of the company Margaret and I had built together. The first thing I did was address the company's financial problems. We restructured the debt, sold some underperforming properties, and focused on completing existing projects rather than taking on new ones. It was a conservative approach, but it was necessary to stabilize the business. The second thing I did was increase salaries for all employees by 15%. The third thing I did was establish a profit-sharing program that gave every worker a stake in the company's success. The fourth thing I did was create a scholarship fund for children of employees who wanted to attend college. Margaret would have approved of these changes, Alexander told me during one of our meetings. She always believed in taking care of the people who made our success possible. Over the following months, I began to understand why Margaret had been so successful in her final years, but also why the company had become overextended. Harrison Development Group was an incredibly well-run company with talented employees, innovative projects, and a strong reputation in the marketplace. But Margaret's relentless focus on growth had pushed the company beyond its financial limits. I worked with Alexander to address these issues, drawing on the partnership skills that Margaret and I had developed during our early years together. We instituted regular employee feedback sessions, improved work-life balance policies, and returned to the personalized service approach that had made Harrison Engineering successful in the 1980s and 1990s. Most importantly, we focused on sustainable growth rather than rapid expansion. Instead of taking on every possible project, we became more selective, choosing developments that matched our expertise and financial capacity. The changes worked. Within 18 months of taking control, the company had paid down most of its debt, Employee satisfaction scores had improved dramatically, and we were generating steady profits again. By early 2025, the business was worth closer to its original estimated value before debt, approximately $31 million. But despite my professional success, I remained completely estranged from my children. Jessica and Marcus wanted nothing to do with me or the company. They returned to their own careers and lives, treating me as if I no longer existed. Holidays passed without phone calls. Birthdays went unacknowledged. I learned about major events in their lives through social media or mutual acquaintances. The loneliness was crushing. I had everything I could possibly want in terms of financial security, but I had lost the two people who mattered most to me. Margaret's inheritance had given me wealth and status, but it couldn't give me back my family. That began to change in January 2024, almost 2 years after the will reading, in a way I never could have anticipated. I was at the office on a Thursday morning when Alexander Petrov knocked on my door with an expression of complete surprise on his face. "Robert, there's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's urgent." "Who is it?" "Jessica." My heart started racing. Jessica hadn't spoken to me since the courthouse confrontation 8 months earlier. "Send her in," I said, trying to compose myself. Jessica entered my office looking nervous and uncomfortable. She was dressed professionally in a dark blue suit, and she carried a leather briefcase that suggested this was business rather than a personal visit. At 38 years old, she looked remarkably like her mother had at that age. The same determined jawline, the same intelligent eyes. "Hello, Dad," she said stiffly. "Jessica, this is a surprise." She sat down across from my desk and placed her briefcase on the floor. "I need to talk to you about something," she said. "It's about Mom's letter." "What about it?" Jessica took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about what she wrote, about the things she said about you and about your marriage. And I've been doing some research." "What kind of research?" "I talked to Patricia, Mom's former assistant. I talked to some of the longtime employees from the early days. I talked to Grandpa Sullivan before he died 6 months ago. I waited for her to continue, afraid to hope. They all told me the same thing," Jessica said quietly. "They all said that you were the reason Mom's business succeeded in the early years. They said you did most of the foundational work but let her take most of the credit. They said you supported every major decision she made, even when you disagreed with it." I didn't say anything, but I felt a small spark of hope beginning to kindle in my chest. "Patricia told me that Mom used to cry in her office sometimes, especially after the divorce. She said Mom regretted losing you but didn't know how to fix what she had broken." Jessica's voice was getting emotional. "Grandpa Sullivan told me that Mom called him several times in 2021, before she died. She told him that divorcing you was the biggest mistake of her life, but she was too proud to try to win you back." I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "Dad, I owe you an apology. A huge apology. Marcus and I blamed you for things that weren't your fault. We believed Mom's version of the story because it was easier than admitting that she had made mistakes." "Jessica, let me finish," she said firmly. "I spent the last 2 years hating you for taking our inheritance. But the truth is you earned that money. You built the foundation that made everything else possible. Mom was right to leave it to you." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder. "I've been working on something," she said. "A proposal." "What kind of proposal?" "I want to come work for Harrison Development Group. I want to learn the business that you and Mom built together. I want to understand what I missed all these years when I was taking her side against you." I was speechless. "I know I don't deserve the opportunity," Jessica continued. "I know I've been terrible to you, but I want to make things right. I want to be part of what you're building." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, for the first time in years. I saw Margaret's determination in her eyes, but I also saw something else. Humility, regret, and a genuine desire to repair our relationship. "What about Marcus?" I asked. Marcus is still angry. He's not ready to admit that we were wrong about you, but I think he'll come around eventually. Sarah's been talking to him about it." Jessica opened the folder and showed me her resume, along with a detailed proposal for how she could contribute to the company. I have 17 years of experience in marketing and business development, she said. I think I could help Harrison Development Group expand into new markets, maybe even develop international opportunities. It was a good proposal. Jessica had impressive credentials and relevant experience. But more importantly, she was offering me something I had wanted for years, a chance to rebuild our relationship. When would you want to start? I asked. As soon as possible, she said. Dad, I've wasted too many years being angry about things I didn't understand. I don't want to waste any more time. Jessica started working at Harrison Development Group the following month. It was awkward at first. She was the owner's daughter joining a company where she knew very few people, but she proved herself quickly. She was brilliant, just like her mother, but she had a collaborative approach that Margaret had sometimes lacked. She listened to other people's ideas, built consensus around decisions, and treated every employee with respect regardless of their position in the company hierarchy. Working with Jessica reminded me of the early days with Margaret, when we had been true partners building something together. But it was even better because Jessica and I weren't trying to balance a romantic relationship with our business partnership. We could focus entirely on creating something meaningful together. Over the following months, our personal relationship began to heal as well. Jessica started calling me regularly, not just about work but about her life, her hopes, her concerns about the future. I'm sorry I missed so many years of your life, she told me during one of our conversations. I want to know everything. I want to understand who you really are, not the version of you that I created in my head. We started having dinner together once a week, just the two of us, talking about everything we had missed during our years of estrangement. Jessica told me about her relationships, her career goals, her thoughts about starting a family someday. I told her about my struggles after the divorce, my loneliness, my fears about growing older alone. You're not alone anymore, she assured me. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Marcus took longer to come around, but eventually he did. The turning point came in June 2024, when his fiancée Sarah insisted on meeting me before their wedding, which was planned for September. I don't understand why you won't talk to your father, she told Marcus. From everything I've heard from Jessica and others, he sounds like a good man who got a raw deal. Sarah arranged a lunch meeting without telling Marcus it was happening. When he walked into the restaurant and saw me sitting with his fiancée, he was furious. What is this? He demanded. This is you finally having an honest conversation with your father, Sarah said firmly. Sit down. It was uncomfortable at first. Marcus was defensive and hostile, still clinging to the narrative that I had somehow manipulated Margaret into leaving me her inheritance. But Sarah was persistent, and she asked hard questions that forced Marcus to examine his beliefs. If your father was such a terrible husband, why did your mother stay married to him for 33 years? She asked. If he never supported her dreams, how did they build a successful company together? If he was jealous of her success, why didn't he demand recognition for his contributions? Gradually, Marcus began to acknowledge the contradictions in the story he had been telling himself about our marriage. I talked to Jessica about this, he admitted finally. She showed me some old letters that Mom wrote to Grandma Sullivan in the 1990s. In the letters, Mom talks about how grateful she was to have a husband who believed in her dreams. What changed? I asked gently. Marcus was quiet for a long time. I think Mom got so focused on success that she forgot about everything else. And I think you reminded her of a time when she was happy but less ambitious, and that made her uncomfortable. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a start. Marcus and Sarah were married in September 2024, and I was invited to the wedding. It was a small ceremony, but it felt like a major victory. For the first time in years, I was included in a significant family event. During the reception, Marcus pulled me aside. Dad, I owe you an apology, he said. I blamed you for things that weren't your fault. I believed a version of the story that wasn't true. We all believed what we needed to believe at the time, I told him. What matters is that we're here now. I've been thinking about Mom's letter, Marcus continued, about what she said about building something meaningful. I want to do that. I want to create something that matters. What did you have in mind? I was thinking about starting a nonprofit organization, something focused on helping divorced fathers maintain relationships with their children. I think there are a lot of guys out there going through what you went through. It was a beautiful idea, and it showed me that Marcus had learned important lessons from our family's experience. I'd like to help, I told him, both financially and personally. Really, let's build something meaningful together. Today, 3 years after that shocking reading, my life looks completely different than I ever could have imagined. Harrison Development Group has grown into a $40 million company with operations in 5 states. We've successfully completed over 40 major projects, from office complexes in Chicago to residential developments in Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio. Jessica serves as Senior Vice President of Business Development and is being groomed to eventually take over as CEO. Alexander Petrov remains as President and continues to oversee day-to-day operations. Marcus founded the Father-Child Connection in early 2025, a nonprofit organization that provides counseling, legal assistance, and support groups for divorced fathers. The organization has already helped over 200 men in the Chicago area rebuild relationships with their children, and we're planning to expand into Milwaukee and Indianapolis this year. I serve on the board of directors and provide substantial financial support. But most importantly, I have my family back. Jessica and I talk almost every day. She's engaged to a wonderful man named Kevin, who works as an architect and shares our passion for building beautiful, functional spaces. They're planning to marry next year, and when they have children, I'll be the grandfather who's actually present in their lives, not the distant figure I had become to Jessica and Marcus. Marcus and Sarah are expecting their first child this fall. They've asked me to be the baby's godfather, and they want the child to call me Grandpa Bobby, the same nickname Jessica and Marcus used when they were small. The money Margaret left me has certainly provided financial security, but more importantly, it has given me the platform to rebuild the relationships that matter most to me. Sometimes I think about Margaret and wonder what she would think of how everything turned out. I believe she would be proud that her final gift accomplished exactly what she hoped it would. It brought our family back together. I still miss her. Despite everything that went wrong between us, Margaret was the love of my life. I understand now that she was trying to build a legacy for our children, and that she lost sight of the personal relationships that should have been part of that legacy. Her final letter was her way of setting the record straight, of making sure that Jessica and Marcus understood the truth about our marriage and our partnership. But it was also her way of giving me a second chance at happiness. I'm 68 years old now, and I have everything I could possibly want. Financial security, meaningful work, and most importantly, the love of my children and soon-to-be grandchildren. Margaret's $21 million inheritance didn't just change my bank account balance. It changed my entire life. And that scream from Jessica in the lawyer's office? It was the sound of a worldview being shattered, but it was also the beginning of something new and better for all of us. Sometimes the most generous gift someone can give you is the truth, even when that truth is painful to hear. Margaret's will wasn't just about money. It was about justice, recognition, and the chance for a family to heal from years of misunderstanding. In her final act, Margaret gave me something more valuable than wealth. She gave me back my children. And that, more than any amount of money, was worth waiting 45 years to receive. If you enjoyed this incredible story of family secrets and ultimate justice, please give this video a big thumbs up and subscribe to his Sweet Revenge for more amazing stories like this one. We post new stories of karma and sweet revenge daily. Ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads, and let us know in the comments what you thought about Margaret's final decision. Do you think she did the right thing? What would you have done in Robert's situation? Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the truth takes years to come out, but when it does, justice is always worth the wait. See you in the next video.